This is a simplified diagram of the weather, with the sunlight coming in at the top here and heat coming in from the oceans, and how it all gets mixed up. When you stand outside, you experience the weather. That is the sum total of everything from cosmic radiation in deep space to heat coming off the bottom of the oceans and everything in between. All right? It is what engineers call a white noise. It's as if you were standing outside of a football stadium and you're 100,000 people. That's a white noise. And what they're trying to tell you is that we know enough about the climate and the weather to be able to pick out individual noises in that stadium. And I'm here to tell you we don't and we can't. What this shows, this came out in 1991, and it was presented as proof that CO2 was driving temperature. Here's the current temperature of the Earth over here, and the blue line is the temperature, the red line is CO2. And the French researchers that brought this out, to Petit and Jouzel, but they were warning. They said, don't rush to judgment on this graph. Because if you look at this graph, when it's in a book, that's about 4 inches of graph that's covering 420,000 years. How much detail can you see? The answer is virtually nothing. Okay? Well, within 5 years, and they were saying, oh, this is proof. This is what these people that were using climate for a political agenda, they said this is proof that the temperature is driving, or CO2 is driving temperature. We knew within 5 years that it showed exactly the opposite. That the temperature changes before the CO2 changes. But what's the whole fundamental assumption that they make? They say, oh, CO2 goes up, the temperature will go up. That doesn't occur in any record anywhere in the world at any time in history. Nowhere. In fact, exactly the opposite happens. So the fundamental assumption they make about CO2 and temperature is wrong. But they blithely carry on because they know the public don't know that and don't understand that. So you can see that here. By the way, well, I'll show you another graph. This shows you 600 million years of the Earth's history. I love it when they come on the radio and say, oh, it's the hottest day ever. Oh, boy, am I glad I lived long enough to see this. And I like to phone in and say, do you really mean ever? Well, no, it's in government record. Oh, that. How did we ever survive before there was government? My goodness, this is amazing. And of course, that's something that you've got to look at. What this shows is the current level, CO2 is the red line. And here we are at the current level, 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And Al Gore tells you that's the highest level we've ever had. Look at this graph. It is in fact the lowest level we've ever had. Okay? And in fact, you could argue, looking at here, the last 300 million years, that the CO2 level has averaged around 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million. 3 times what we've currently got. And do you know how we know that's important to the Earth? Because if you go to the greenhouses on the coast here, the commercial greenhouses, they pump up to 1,200 parts per million of CO2 to get the plants to grow more vigorously. In fact, you could, and Dr. Idso has done 30 years of research showing that increased CO2 increases the yield of the plant. And also, by the way, reduces the amount of water it uses. So I think that that's 300 million years of evolution of plants to an optimum level of about 1,200 parts per million. So you could argue, say, the plants are malnourished at 400 parts per million. Here's another interesting thing. About 480,000 or 480 million years ago, 438 million years, sorry, when the Democrats were still in power. Sorry. Remember, if you can't take a joke. But here's the temperature. The blue line is the temperature. This is the Ordovician Ice Age, 438 million years ago. An ice age. But what's the level of CO2? 4,000 parts per million. And they're telling you at 400 parts per million, we're in runaway potential of global warming. The evidence doesn't support anything that they're saying. Nothing. But they still push that agenda. But here, this shows you that same ice core record from Antarctica. Here's the current temperature, and the temperature goes down to the ice age in here, and then up. So these peaks are what we call interglacials. You should be darn grateful we live in an interglacial. Canada's certainly grateful. It wouldn't have existed 20,000 years ago. All right? And so when you look at this, and then again, remember what they're telling you. Oh, it's warmer than it's ever been. But look at the previous interglacials, how warm they were. And you go back to 120,000 years. Barney Rubble wasn't driving a car. Okay? It's got nothing to do with CO2. But what I want you to notice is look at how quickly the temperature rose, but how quickly it also drops. Look at the variability. That's about 40 degrees Fahrenheit or more of variability of temperature in each of those ups and downs. That's normal. This is 18,000 years ago, and you see the sea level, and look at the rapid rise in sea level in a period of about 6,000 years. Oh, they're telling Al Gore, oh, the sea level's going to rise, it's going to be the end of the world. Panicking you with that. And then, so you see from here about 15,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, that's when the dramatic increase in sea level, so 427 feet approximately. For the last 8,000 years, sea level has increased very, very slightly. And this is another problem. You see, they tell you, oh, you heard another story about Antarctica, and oh, it's going to melt and crash into the ocean, the sea level is going to rise. Hang on a minute. Remember the old grade 8 experiment when you put a glass of water and you put an ice cube in it? And what will happen when the ice cube melts? Most people think the water will spill out over the edge of the glass, and it's not right. Some will say, well, the water level will stay the same. They're not right either. In fact, the water level will go down, right? Because when water freezes into ice, it expands. The ice occupies more space than the water that formed it. So if the Antarctic and Greenland ice caps were to melt, most of them are already below sea level. So that, in fact, wouldn't affect sea level. In fact, it would cause a decline in sea level. But they don't tell you that, right? So, and then, if you're standing on the shore, like you're down in the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana coastline there, you say, oh, the sea level's coming in. It's advancing in. You know what's happening there? The land is sinking. The land is sinking. Because you can stand on a shoreline, and if the sea level line is moving, you don't know if it's because the water's rising or falling or because the land rising or falling. And I can show you places all around the world. Hudson Bay in Canada is getting smaller at a very rapid rate. A place called Sloop's Cove, where the Hudson Bay Company used to tie up their sailing ships, is now above water even at high tide. And that's in just 200 years. That's geologic change. That's tremendous. So change, very dramatic, going on all of the time. This is a graph of about 10,000 years. And you notice what I'm doing is taking very long records, and then we're looking at shorter and shorter time periods. This is from Greenland. This is ice core data, the temperature from Greenland over the last 10,000 years. Here's the current temperature over here. It's been warmer than the current temperature for most of the last 10,000 years. But again, they don't tell you that. It is that warming that caused the ice to melt. It's called the Holocene optimum. Optimum, warmer temperatures. All right, and they're saying, oh, 2 to 3 degrees warmer is going to be the end of the world. How did the polar bear survive this? How did the polar bear survive this? Well, we'll look at that question because, of course, that's one of the things that they want to play on people's emotions with. And this is looking at the last 1,000 years of European temperatures. Here's the current temperature. And going back, you can see to the Little Ice Age, around 1680, the nadir of temperatures then. And when you look here at Dickens' winter, what do you think of when you think of Charles Dickens? You think of Christmas Carol, snowy winters, harsh conditions, workhouses. The first 9 years of Dickens' life in London, it snowed every single winter, and the snow stayed on the ground for 3 months. You don't even get a vestige of that today. Nobody's arguing that warming hasn't occurred. The question is, how long has the warming been going on? Well, the most recent warming, as I said, is from the Little Ice Age. You don't understand the fur trade unless you understand how cold it was in the 17th century in Europe. I gave a talk to a group, and it was a French historian of French clothing. You think you had a boring job. Right? And he came up after and he said, you know, I was reading about French aristocrats wearing fur underwear. Right? And he said, I couldn't make any sense out of it. And he said, now when I find out how cold it was, during the Little Ice Age, this is a painting of the Thames of London. In 1683, there was 3 feet of ice on the Thames in London, England. You can't even imagine that today. And again, as I said, think about the fur trade, the demand for furs and what this meant. And you can see here they're working. This is the old London Bridge before it fell down. And then this Swedish alarmist, Bo Yellen, he said, I agree with Nick that climate change might be a better labeling than global warming. They deliberately changed the labeling. And so you start to see what's going on. That their global warming scare, the evidence, this, by the way, their hypothesis was CO2 goes up, the temperature will go up. Well, the CO2 was continuing to go up, but the temperature wasn't going up anymore. This is what Huxley said 100 years ago is the great bane of science, a wonderful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. Right? And so you had this difficulty. And here's the graph. Taking that from 1998 on, you can see the temperature declining slightly. Look what the CO2 is going. It's not supposed to happen. Not supposed to happen, but that's what's going on. The problem is their computer models are wrong. They don't work. Every prediction they've made using these computer models has been wrong. I mean, everyone, every single one. And this is part of the difficulty. This is how the computer models are created. They divide the world up into grids. And the smallest grids are like this one is 3 degrees latitude by 3 degrees longitude. That's a large area. But here's the problem. 85% of the world, we have no weather stations. 70% of the oceans, virtually no weather stations. 20% of the land is mountains. 19% is desert. No weather stations. Most of the weather stations are concentrated in eastern North America and western Europe. And so, what are they building these models on? And the answer is, they create a model for each grid, and they guess at what the temperature might be in that grid. Because this is the point they've reached, because they haven't got the data. They create a computer model that tells them, oh, here's the data. They take that then as real data and put it into another computer model, when it isn't real data. That's how corrupted this has become. And so you can see. And by the way, you think we haven't got any data on the surface. When you get above the surface, we've got even less. We've got even less. We know virtually nothing about what's going on in the atmosphere from the surface up. The inability of forecast? Well, here's those graphs of temperature and the change from warming to climate change. This is the surface temperature. This is the satellite leveling off. This is their forecasts. But you see, after 1990, their forecasts were so wrong, they changed the name again. They stopped saying we're doing predictions, we're doing projections. All right? And so they came up with, they brought a low projection, a best projection, and a high projection. Even the low projections are wrong. And would you buy anything from anybody that was wrong with every previous forecast they've told you? But that's what they expect you to do. And this is the multi-model predictions from 23 countries. Here's the actual temperature. The Canadian model, as I said, was worse than any of them. Its projections were the worst. And that's not surprising, because see, one of the things that everybody knows, if you can't forecast the weather 2, 3, 4 days from now, how can you possibly tell me what it's going to be like 40 and 50 years from now? You can't. Right? And I like to tell the farmers that. Phone Environment Canada and say, what's it going to be like a year from now? And they say, oh, we don't do long-term forecasts. And then phone them the next day and say, what's it going to be like 50 years from now? Warmer? I got to disconnect here. Time to disconnect here. The Canadian government, Environment Canada, they give a 3-month, 6-month, 12-month forecast, and then they publish how often that forecast has been accurate in the last 30 years. Well, if I tell you that this is a map, it's a 12-month accuracy forecast. The gray is less than 40% accuracy. In other words, you could be better with tossing a coin. And the dark blue, less than 45%. The average accuracy for all of Canada is 41.5%. Would you buy anything from somebody like? But what's amazing is they publish this on their own website. They say, look how bad we are. Oh, keep sending the chat. It's incredible. I want to show you this quote. This is from a person who is a meteorologist and physicist. His name's Klaus Eckert, please. And this is what he said about a year ago. 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, told us. One day, I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it. Scientifically, it is sheer absurdity to think you can get a nice climate by turning a CO2 adjustment knob. That is a phenomenal statement for a scientist to make. It is absolutely outstanding, amazing, because it contradicts everything that you're being told. Totally contradicts everything you're being told. And one of the things they tell you is, oh, there's going to be more severe weather. We're having more severe weather. And of course, they want to do that because they want to play on the perception people have. Because it seems like every time you turn on the TV, oh, here's another severe weather event. But here's a plot of tropical storms and hurricanes from 1971 to the present. Show me the increase. Do you know the year when most people died from tornadoes in the US? 1905. 250 people died in 1905. And there weren't that many people living in Tornado Alley at that time. And here's another example of how they exploit it. This is the US tornadoes from 1950 to 2007. You say, well, there it is. Oh yeah, tornadoes increasing. But let's look at the facts. Population growth has resulted in more tornadoes being reported. Do you know that Environment Canada is not allowed to say that there was a tornado unless somebody saw it? Right? Got to see it to report it. So you got more people there, we're going to see more tornadoes. Advances in weather radar, particularly the deployment of about 100 Doppler radars across the US in the mid-90s, has resulted in a much higher tornado detection rate. The increase. So suddenly when you start to look at and explain this data, you see that that increase probably doesn't exist at all. And tornado damage surveys have grown more sophisticated over the years. Do you know who made one of the most honest statements recently, believe it or not, was Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's very heavily invested in insurance. And he said, I've been looking at our records and we've got no increase in claims for quite some time. And what's significant about that? Who would benefit more by saying, oh, it's terrible, you buy more insurance, than the guy that owns the insurance company? Okay? It's the same way as Warren Buffett's pushing the railway and opposed to the Keystone Pipeline because he owns the railway lines across northern US, all right? And so you start to look, what is that? Somebody very wisely said, follow the money, wasn't it? Yes, something like that. And here you've got, this is the US annual count of strong to violent tornadoes, 1954 through 2012. There's no increase, simply no increase. This picture on the left, because you hear about the polar bears drowning, and this was a photograph that Al Gore used in his movie. The woman who took this picture was on a tourist ship in the Arctic. And she said the polar bears weren't threatened, they weren't drowning, nothing. In fact, they climbed up on this ice to see what was on the ship. And they saw food. Right? They are superb swimmers. In the search and rescue we did in the Arctic, I've seen polar bears 100 miles offshore. Why do they swim so well? Because their long fur is hollow. And it's hollow because it transmits sunlight down into the body to keep the body warm. Because it's hollow, of course, it floats. Next time you see a polar bear in the water, you'll see all that fur up, and of course it just paddles away happily looking for food. But one of the things about the polar bear is it only appeared in the Arctic about 100,000 years ago. In biologic terms, that's yesterday. It is actually a modified version of the Alaska brown bear. And because it so recently arrived in the Arctic and modified to a white fur, you find hybrid polar bears. Polar bear grizzly hybrids. And of course the Alaska brown bear lives on land. Polar bears live on land very well, thank you very much. That's how they survived that warm period I showed you when the ice was melting. So all of this nonsense about polar bears. But what happened? Canada, we call the Eskimos Inuit. That's what they wanted to be called. The Inuit have always insisted the bear's demise was greatly exaggerated by scientists doing projections based on flyover counts, but their input was usually dismissed as the ramblings of self-interested hunters. How did that come about? Well, the US government said, no, you can't hunt polar bears in Canada. How they got away with that, I don't know. But I can tell you the Inuit people were entitled to hunt one polar bear a year, provided the polar bear expert at Igloolik, by the name of Mitch Taylor, if he said the polar bear numbers were adequate, they were allowed to hunt one polar bear per family per year. But very few of them did it. What most of them did was they sold that hunting license. And they could get anywhere from $80,000 to $120,000 for that hunting license. And when you're living in the Arctic, that's a lot of money. That's a big income. Gone. Deprived, completely gone. And Mitch Taylor, Nunavut Government Biologist, observed in the front page story in the Nutskiat News, the Inuit were right. There aren't just a few more bears, there are a hell of a lot more bears. So all of that nonsense about the polar bears disappearing is just that. And so, and by the way, Canada had a polar bear conference 2 years ago. They told the Inuit leaders and Mitch Taylor, don't show up. They banned them from coming. You know what Malthus's view was? There are too many people. We've got to reduce the number of people. And the governments are not helping because the governments are giving out money to the poor. Right? They're helping the poor. They're helping those people that shouldn't be having children. Okay? So Malthus was really a eugenicist. Got to reduce the population. And what he argued was that the population would outgrow the food supply. That idea got picked up by this guy, Paul Ehrlich, at Stanford University. Yeah, okay, and he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And published, and here you see some of his predictions. The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve, including Americans. I think you got the other end of the problem, don't you? I wouldn't be a judgmental Canadian and make any comment about that. But yeah. So here you see, smog disasters, 1973 might kill 200,000 people in New York and Los Angeles. Yeah, thin the herd. I like that. That's a good name. I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. This guy's still teaching at the university. I mean, it's unbelievable that you can be that wrong. And then he said, before 1985, mankind will enter a genuine age of scarcity in which the accessible supplies of many key minerals will be facing depletion. An economist by the name of Julian Simon took a bet with him. And he said, I'll bet you pick any minerals and you pick any time period, and I'll bet you by the end of it, there'll be more minerals at a lower price. And Ehrlich took the bet. But he hired somebody to pick the minerals in the time period. And he picked this guy, John Holdren, who is now Obama's science czar. Okay? And Holdren wrote a book with Paul Ehrlich called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment. And here's one of the things he says in the book. Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution. So how could that be? But here's the game. Here's the game. Many years ago, H.L. Mencken, who I used to think was far too cynical, but as I get older, I realize was very wise. H.L. Mencken said that the urge to save the planet is almost always a false front for the urge to rule. Yes. Okay? And in order to justify doing what under normal circumstances people would say, you can't do that. Forced abortions? What kind of a state do you think we're living in? But look what he says. Under the existing, if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger society, oh, we're doing this for the greater good. Oh, we're taking over your land for the greater good. We're taking over your water resources for the greater good. We're saving the planet. You don't care about the planet or the children? What kind of a monster are you? See, that's the moral high ground they take. That's the way it's played. So you've got to look at, how do they justify this? And there you see it. Holdren, by the way, was a promoter of eugenics, the idea that you select certain people. And then that got put into the Club of Rome, which was founded by David Rockefeller in 1961. And these guys, King and Schneider, said the common enemy of humanity is man. There's that theme we talked about earlier. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming. See, they needed something that was going to impact the whole Earth. Because then they could say, hey, individual nations aren't capable of dealing with this. It's got to be one world government. It's got to be a total world government. That's the only way we can handle this. It's a threat to the whole of the planet. That's the game that's going on here. The Club of Rome got, by the way, into the Agenda 21. We'll get to that in a minute. But here's the interesting thing. This goes back to about early 60s at least. This is called the demographic transition model. What it shows is that as your economy improves, your population declines. Okay? Why? Why did people have a lot of children in the old days? Because that was their pension plan. And they had lots of children because if 3 out of 10 survived, you were lucky. I advise you all to read a book called The Weaker Vessel, which was the lot of English women in the 15th and 16th century. And when I tell you that Queen Anne had 19 children, and she outlived all of them, only one of them lived to the age of 7. These are conditions we can't even relate to Africa today. The average woman in the 17th century had 23 confinements, that is 23 pregnancies. And what they did was, the child was, the second it was born, it was baptized because they didn't want it to die with original sin. They baptized it and say, oh, this child is Elizabeth. And then if Elizabeth died, the next girl that was born was called Elizabeth. They kept using the name till the child lived. We don't even relate to those things. You don't understand what history was like and what it was all about. And by the way, Antonia Fraser wrote about that in a book called The Weaker Vessel, which was the description of women in the 15th and 16th century. But the demographic transition shows if you allow economic development, the population goes down. This is Maurice, a Canadian, who it was interviewed, and he said, isn't the only hope for the planet the industrialized nations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? He's a member of the Club of Rome. Okay, a very good friend of the Canadian Prime Minister. And he started all of this. He took it from the Club of Rome and put it into the United Nations. How would you do this? How would you bring about the end of the industrialized nations? Well, if you think about the industrialized nation driven by fossil fuel like the engine of a car, you can stop the engine of the car by squeezing off the fuel line. But if you do that, people scream right away. You've experienced that. The price of gasoline goes up, everybody's in a riot. Right? But you can also stop the engine by plugging the exhaust. So if you could tell people, hey, the exhaust from your engine or your industrialized nation is causing runaway global warming, and we've got to stop it. And what is the exhaust from that fossil fuel engine? CO2. So now we come full cycle around, why did they choose CO2? Because it wanted to fulfill this. Got to shut down the industrialized nations. And of course you see that's what Obama's doing. The coal plants and all the rest of it. And if you want to see the effects of what happens when you institute those policies, in the same year that he chaired the Rio Summit in 1992, he became the head of Ontario Hydro, which is the public utility in Ontario, Canada, that controls all energy in that province. And he shut down the nuclear plants, he shut down the coal plants, and he built wind turbines. And ever since, Ontarians have been paying a surcharge on their electricity bills. And they'll be paying it for 40 years as they attempt to catch up with the damage that he did. But he wants that for the whole world. That's what he wants for the whole world. And so this guy, I mean, he's got a lot to answer for. By the way, when Elaine Dewar, who interviewed him for her book, said, well, that's a good idea, why don't you run for politics? Oh, he said, you can't do anything as a politician. I'm going to the United Nations where I can get all the money I want, not be accountable to anybody. But he's become accountable. Do you know where he is now? He's hiding out in China, where he's saying China's the greatest country in the world. Right? Yeah, great, if you can live there on your billions. Do you know why he's hiding out in China? Because the US government want him for fraud. Because he and his son, Kofi Annan, who was the head of the United Nations, and his son, made millions of dollars off of that food for oil in Iraq scam. And we've actually got photographs of a South Korean businessman with $1 million check being handed over on this deal. So that's in the United States, this is Senator Tim Wirth. He was the guy that put this on the political table because he wanted a scientist that would say that humans were causing the global warming. And he found a guy by the name of James Hansen who was working for NASA. And Hansen said, yeah, I'll come before your committee and I'll say that. It's not possibly true, but yeah, he said, I'll say that. He was rewarded by being made head of NASA GIS for the rest of his career. Okay? He, while he was a senior bureaucrat, was protesting before the White House, which completely defies your Hatch Act, which limits the political activity of senior bureaucrats. While he was the head of NASA GIS, he flew to Britain and defended 4 Greenpeace people who had bombed a coal plant. And they got off on the grounds that here was this senior American scientist saying that what they were doing was justified. But what happened with Wirth? He said, well, we've got to get this Hansen to appear before a Senate committee. And so they set it up, and this is the level of corruption. And you can Google this on Frontline, PBS Frontline, Wirth's interview. They figured out which was the hottest day of the year in Washington from the record, June the 6th. And they said, okay, that's the day we'll have we'll have Hansen in to talk about global warming and the heat, the runaway heat. But the night before, they went into the Senate and they opened the windows and shut off the air conditioning. So the whole thing was held in sweltering heat. And of course, what better ambiance to make your argument about global warming? That's this man. Guess where he's working now? Gave up a nice Senate seat. He's now with the United Nations. We'll go through this fairly quickly, but here's Maurice Strong, the political United Nations, Rio in 1992. And then, of course, the scientific, they set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to create the science that they needed to prove their political point, to focus on CO2. Well, here's how they controlled the climate thing. By the definition, they were told to look at a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over considerable time. In other words, only look at human causes. Don't look at what nature's doing. You can't possibly determine this if you don't know what nature's doing. It's impossible. So the IPCC were very restricted right from the start to only looking at human causes. And of course that narrows it to CO2. So here they did the science report, and from the science report they say, yeah, oh yeah, CO2 is causing it, we're 95% certain. So then the second group say, okay, it's humans causing the warming, so we'll look at the impacts. And these guys say, oh, you know, the polar bear is going to die, this is going to happen, all the negative things, that's all you hear in the media. They never look at the positive sides of warming. You know, there's Canadians up there saying, come on, warming. You never think about that. It's like an economist doing a cost-benefit study and only looking at the cost. It's exactly what's going on here. And of course, then they corrupt it even more. Because here's the science report, and then once all of this is finished, they keep that, they don't disclose that, they produce a summary report. And the summary report doesn't agree with what the science report says at all, because it's produced by different people. And it's released to the public with all the scares and all of the false claims. And somebody asked me coming in here tonight, have you read the 816 pages of this summary? And yes, I have. And it's unbelievable bunch of lies. Completely false information. And then they release this, and then this goes back to the scientists saying, make sure that your science report agrees with what we told the public. This is like an executive doing a study of his company and then saying to the employees, make sure you find evidence to support the conclusions I've already reached. It's exactly what they're doing. It's exactly what they're doing. I love this. This is the cartoon. The other thing that's driving so much of this, of course, is the funding. This is Dr. Bagshaw, discovery of the infinitely expanding research grant. The billions that have gone into climate research, just frightening. And yet they still can't forecast any better. Let's look at the data. This is NASA GIS, the number of stations starting in before 1900, reached a peak in 1960. They've been closing weather stations ever since. One of the reasons they argued was because of the satellites. But the satellites can't see through cloud. It can't tell you whether it rained or snowed or whether any precipitation fell at all. In fact, you remember when the first satellite images came in, here's the satellite, they had to draw the outline of the state so you could tell what you were looking at through the cloud, okay? But they declined. But then they reduced the number of stations, but they selected only stations that showed significant warming. And so here's the number of stations declining, and then the drop in 1990, but look what happened to global temperatures. And let me show you how bad that was. Here's Canada. These diamonds are the only stations that they use to determine Canada's average temperature. Look at the Arctic. This whole Arctic archipelago, which is larger than the continental US, they got one station. For the whole of the Canadian Arctic. And I know Eureka, and I've been in there, and I've done studies with people. It's a uniquely warm spot in the Arctic. That's why they chose it. Okay? In fact, there are plants there that survived the last ice age. That's how unique it is. So when you start to look. There's a lawsuit that I've been part of in New Zealand, because what every government in the world has been doing is been lowering the historic record to make the slope of the temperature increase look greater than it actually is. This is for Auckland Airport. The blue line is the actual readings. The red line is the government adjusted readings. And here you can see what they've done for the whole of New Zealand. They've done that for every single country, every record in the world. And when we brought the lawsuit against the New Zealand government said, oh yeah, we'll go to court over it. And then a week before we were going to go to court, they said, oh no, we won't go to court. We'll have a commission of inquiry. Oh yeah, oh yeah. And who did they choose to do the commission of inquiry? The Australian Weather Bureau, who were doing exactly the same thing. I just got one record here. This is Ruth Glen. Here's the actual original, and here's the adjusted record. They've all been doing it. So they can claim that the temperature's gone up much more than actually happened. But this is one of the first bits of corruption. This is an upper atmosphere temperature record from 1955 to 1995. That's the actual record. Here's what went into their report. They selected, this was done by Benjamin Santer, the lead author, so they selected this portion which showed an increase. They said, oh, there it is, it's warming. But look at the original record. I mean, this is so corrupt that you don't know where to start talking about it. And when Santer was challenged on this, this is what they had agreed to. I'll just show you, I think there's 3 here. Yeah. This is what they agreed to go into the report. All the scientists agreed. None of the studies cited above have shown clear evidence that we can attribute the observed causes to the specific cause of increased greenhouse gases. While some of the pattern-based discussed here have claimed detection of a significant climate change, no study to date has positively attributed all or part of climate change to man-made causes. Any claim of positive detection or attribution of significant change are likely to remain controversial until certainty is in the total natural variability of the system. That's what they were going to put into the report. All of the scientists combined. Santer went off on his own, and when he submitted the report and it came out, this is what he put in there. There is evidence of an emerging pattern of climate response to forcing by greenhouse gases. Completely contradicts this. And he said, the body of statistical evidence in Chapter 8, when examined in the context of our physical understanding of the climate system, now points to a discernible human influence on the global climate. But these guys said there was no evidence of that. But guess what the media picked up on? A discernible human influence. That became the headline in the New York Times. Santer, of course, said, oh, I'm having a nervous breakdown, I can't cope, and he went off to Lawrence Livermore, and he's still sciencing out there. I mean, just absolutely amazing. But we go back to this graph that I showed you earlier. This is the 1,000 years, the warming of the medieval optimum, and this medieval warm period. This graph created a great problem for them because it appeared in the first report in 1990. And it was produced by Hubert Lamb. And of course, here they were saying this is as warm as it's ever been. And people like me were saying, well, what about the medieval warm period? It was warmer 1,000 years ago. We had all this evidence to support that. This is testimony from David Deming, who I've known for 30 years. This is his testimony to the US Congress, so it's given under oath. And he said, with the publication of the article in Science, I gained significant credibility in the community of scientists working on climate change. They thought I was one of them. Sounds almost paranoid, doesn't it? But one of them. Someone who would pervert science in the service of social and political causes. So one of them let his guard down. A major person working in the area of climate change and global warming sent me an astonishing email that said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. We have to rewrite history. Can you imagine? We have to rewrite history. And that's what they did. And they produced this graph, infamously called the hockey stick. Right? And to be full disclosure, the person that produced this is Michael Mann, who is at Penn State. He is now suing me. I have a large lawsuit against me by him because I showed how they corrupted the data and what they'd done. And the interviewer said, what do you think about Mr. Mann? And I flippantly said, he's at Penn State, but he should be at State Penn.
No sense of humor.
No sense of humor. And of course, by the way, in Canada, no protection of free speech. That's why the lawsuit was filed in Canada. I would never have had the lawsuit here in the US. If you want to get a measure of how valuable your free speech is to you, wait until you've been sued for saying something and you find out just how nasty it is and how bad it is. I mean, it was a flippant comment. In fact, we've discovered since that one rap singer had already made the comment, but he didn't get sued. But what Michael Mann did was he used tree rings to produce this decline in temperature. You see the medieval warm period's gone. What's the mistake with this? Tree rings don't show temperature. They're precipitation driven. And he only selected one tree ring set which showed the declining temperature. But then they had a problem because the temperature on the tree rings kept going down into the 20th century. So what they did was they cut it off at 1900 and they tacked on modern instrumental record, which is completely scientifically corrupt. And what we got from the leaked emails, what they were doing. They instructed the computer to hide the decline. That was the phrase that was used. That, oh, we can't have that decline, so we've got to hide it. So whenever the thing starts to go down, plug in this data and that'll make it go back up again. Okay? That's what went on. And two Canadians by the name of McIntyre and McKittrick reconstructed some of the data, and of course there the medieval warm period shows up again, and here you can see. But look at this blade of the hockey stick. That's instrumental record. This was produced by Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, who was heavily involved in this corruption. And he claimed the global average surface temperature increased by 0.6 to plus or minus 0.2 in the late 19th century. So the temperature went up 0.6 degrees in about 120 years. That's what he claimed. But look at this. 0.6 degrees plus or minus 0.2. This is a range of error of plus or minus 33%. It's meaningless. It's like the radio station said, well, we've done a poll for this vote coming up, and it's accurate to within plus or minus 33%. But that's in the official report. It's in the official report. And when the Australian, Warwick Hughes, the Australian climatologist, sent an email to Jones and said, he asked for the data. He said, show us the data. How did you get this blade of the hockey stick? And this is what Jones replied. We have 25 years or so invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it? I mean, people don't believe that this is going on amongst world-class scientists. That's the problem. You know, it's almost like the priest thing, that you can't believe and you don't want to believe. But that's the difficulty. And so, of course, and by the way, and in the leaked emails, Jones is saying, I hope they don't find out that they can get the data through freedom of information. And so they found different ways to hide the data. Finally, they got pushed hard enough, and oh, lo and behold, Mr. Jones lost his data. He lost his data, okay? And Michael Mann, of course, is now refusing to disclose his calculations of how he made the hockey stick. Right? He's refusing to disclose it. And you remember the old math exam in school? Show your work. Show your work. Right? Because you might have cheated from your neighbor, right?
One other thing I wanted to inform Dr. Ball that Paul Ehrlich, I don't know if you know him personally, but you're probably unaware that he just came out with a new prediction. He says very soon we'll be eating each other. We're going to revert to cannibalism. I'm not kidding, he did. So.